Ladies and gentlemen, you are not going to believe what unfolded in Washington, D.C. And if you want to keep catching these explosive moments as they happen, make sure you smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe right now. Because what you're about to hear is one of those confrontations that doesn't just stay in the room, it goes viral. It rewrites the script, and it leaves even the most powerful figures shaken. Now, let's step inside that room. The air inside the exclusive policy roundtable felt heavy, like the tension had been bottled and sealed long before the first words were spoken. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a stage, carefully set with polished mahogany tables, bright lights bouncing off glass water pitchers, and an audience stacked with journalists, operatives, and lawmakers who all seemed to know exactly who the star of the show was supposed to be. At the head of the table sat George Soros, the billionaire power broker whose reputation for pulling political strings stretched across continents. His presence filled the room like a shadow. He didn't need to raise his voice or wave his hands. He radiated authority simply by being there, every glance and every measured word carrying the weight of decades spent shaping the global order. For him, this wasn't just another discussion. This was his domain, his agenda, and in his mind, his rules. Across from him, however, sat someone he hadn't anticipated would refuse to play the role he had assigned, Karoline Leavitt. Young, sharp, and unflinching, she had not been brought in as a partner or collaborator. She was the token conservative voice, a name included on the guest list to make the gathering appear balanced, while in reality she was expected to be outnumbered, overwhelmed, and politely sidelined. But Karoline hadn't shown up to nod along. She had come armed with something Soros wasn't used to being confronted with: direct, unapologetic defiance. From the moment the introductions faded, the imbalance was clear. Soros spoke first, as everyone expected, his tone calm and deliberate, his words carrying that familiar mix of lofty ideals and subtle control. He talked about safeguarding democracy, about inclusive borders, about the grand vision of a connected world. His allies at the table nodded on cue. Journalists scribbled, cameras swiveled gently in his direction. It was a performance he had given countless times before, polished down to the syllable. But as his speech rolled on, Karoline leaned back in her chair, studying him with the composure of someone who wasn't there to be dazzled. She heard the careful phrasing, the selective language. She heard what wasn't being said. When the moment came for responses, her voice cut through the room like a blade against silk. Calm but unyielding, she raised her first objection, that the very policies Soros had poured billions into were the same ones fueling crime waves, eroding safety, and destabilizing communities across America. The room shifted. A few eyebrows rose. The journalists glanced up from their notebooks. Even the cameras almost instinctively tilted in her direction. For the first time that afternoon, George Soros was not the sole center of attention. He responded with a smirk, a quiet, condescending chuckle that seemed to say, "Is this really the best they could bring against me?" And then came the line, delivered with the kind of practiced superiority only a man of his status could project. "Young lady, I've been shaping global policy since before you were born. You can't expect to understand the complexities here." The implication was clear. Sit down, stay quiet, and let the grown-ups handle this. But Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. Her reply was instant, sharp, and loaded with precision. "And yet, with all your decades of experience, you've managed to turn thriving neighborhoods into war zones. I understand that perfectly." The silence that followed was deafening. A few heads turned. Some in the room shifted uncomfortably. Soros's smirk faltered for just a second, and in that second, Karoline knew she had drawn blood. The verbal fencing match had officially ended. What was about to unfold wasn't polite sparring anymore. It was a battle, one that would leave the room changed forever. The atmosphere thickened. The air charged with something that felt closer to combat than conversation. Soros steepled his fingers, narrowing his gaze, signaling that the young voice across the table had just broken the unspoken rule of the room. No one challenges the king in his own castle. But Karoline wasn't here to play by his rules. She wasn't here to retreat. She was here to speak for those voices that never got invited into rooms like this. And for the first time in a long time, George Soros realized that control of the narrative was slipping from his grip. And this was only the beginning. This is where the gloves start to come off. And trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how this escalates, because what happened next had the entire room holding its breath. Don't forget to like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss moments like this. The discussion had only just begun when George Soros tried to reassert his dominance over the room. Leaning forward, he spoke in that calm, calculated tone that carried the weight of decades in the political arena. He rolled out his well-rehearsed talking points about building a global future, ensuring economic justice, and creating shared responsibility. The familiar buzzwords hung in the air like smoke, carefully chosen, polished for media soundbites, designed to draw nods of approval from his allies. And the nods came, almost on cue. Lawmakers leaned in, think tank operatives murmured their approval, journalists scribbled as if every word was gospel. This was Soros's script, and everyone in the room seemed to be willing to play their part, except for Karoline Leavitt. She waited patiently, not fidgeting, not rushing in to interrupt. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough after he finished to make the room shift its focus. Then, with a voice clear, steady, and cutting, she launched her first strike. "Mr. Soros," she said, her tone sharp but composed, "you talk about safeguarding democracy, but let's be honest. Your billions haven't safeguarded anything. They've destabilized communities. They've spiked crime rates. You've taken thriving neighborhoods and left them in chaos." The reaction was immediate. A murmur rippled across the table. A few pens froze in mid-scribble. The cameras, as though guided by instinct, swung toward her. For the first time, George Soros wasn't the only star of the show. Soros chuckled softly, the sound dripping with condescension. "Young lady," he said, his accent sharpening the edges of his words, "I've been shaping global policy since before you were even born. You can't begin to understand the complexities of what we're discussing here." It was meant to put her in her place, but Karoline didn't flinch. Her response was instant, her words striking like a hammer against stone. "And yet," she fired back, "with all those decades of experience, you've managed to turn success into failure, safety into fear. That's not complexity, Mr. Soros. That's incompetence." Gasps broke the silence. The smirk that had lingered on Soros's face evaporated. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and the polite veneer of the conversation began to crack. The air grew heavier, the tension more palpable. Karoline had just crossed the invisible line, the one where polite disagreement turns into open challenge, and everyone in the room could feel it. This wasn't going to be a scripted discussion anymore. This was the opening salvo of a battle, one that would soon push Soros past the breaking point. The air inside the room had shifted. What started as a polished policy roundtable now felt like a battlefield dressed up in suits and ties. The silence after Karoline's last strike still lingered, hanging heavy over the polished mahogany. Soros had been challenged, not with a whisper, not with a polite disagreement, but with a direct, unflinching rebuke, and he didn't like it. He adjusted his posture, leaning back in his chair, steepling his fingers the way seasoned power players do when they want to signal control, his eyes fixed on Karoline with a mixture of irritation and measured restraint. When he spoke again, his tone was smooth, dripping with intellectual superiority. "You mistake cause for effect," he began, his accent sharpening every syllable. Crime is not the result of my policies. It is the result of inequality. Inequality that my initiatives have worked tirelessly to correct. Perhaps if you had the breadth of knowledge or the years of experience I possess, you'd see the nuances here instead of parroting talking points. The jab was deliberate, a strike meant to dismiss her as an inexperienced child dabbling in adult matters. His allies nodded in agreement, tossing quick glances at Karoline as if expecting her to shrink under the weight of his words. But Karoline didn't shrink. She leaned forward. "What you call nuance, Mr. Soros," she replied, her voice steady but sharp, "most Americans call excuses. You can bury the truth under layers of think tank jargon and academic studies, but at the end of the day, people are living in fear because of policies you bankroll. That's not nuance, that's reality." The room stirred. A few attendees shifted in their seats. The balance of power, once tilted entirely in Soros's favor, now felt like it was sliding. For the first time, Soros looked unsettled. His jaw tightened. His smirk was gone. One of his operatives jumped in, trying to regain ground. "With respect, Karoline, the data shows long-term improvements. What you're describing is short-term fluctuation." She cut him off without hesitation. "Tell that to the families who can't walk safely in their neighborhoods tonight. Tell that to the shop owners cleaning up broken glass from riots. Long-term improvements don't mean much when people are suffering now." Her words hit like body blows. The operative fell silent. Soros's gaze darkened. Finally, he placed both palms flat on the table, leaning forward, his voice rising just enough to ripple across the room. "This is my meeting, and I will not have it hijacked by your baseless accusations." But Karoline didn't blink. She fired back instantly, her tone cutting like a blade. "Then maybe you should stop giving me so much to work with." The room froze. Gasps echoed. Every eye swung between Soros and Karoline, the tension stretching to its breaking point. This was no longer a discussion. It was a duel, and the next move would push Soros past the edge of control.
The silence after Karoline's last line, "Then maybe you should stop giving me so much to work with," wasn't just silence. It was a detonation, the kind that rips through a room and leaves everyone staring, stunned, waiting for what comes next. Soros's jaw locked tight, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. For a man whose image was built on patience and precision, the cracks were showing. His carefully constructed composure was slipping, and everyone in the room could feel it. The air grew heavier. You could practically hear the hum of cameras adjusting their focus, microphones catching every breath, every shift of posture. Some guests shifted in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between Soros and Karoline. Others leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle they knew was about to erupt. And erupt it did. Soros leaned forward, his face tightened into something far sharper than the calm elder statesman routine he had worn at the start. His voice cut through the room, louder than it had been all day, raw with frustration. "Get out!" The words cracked like a whip. They weren't polished, they weren't rehearsed, they were shouted. An order, not a request, drenched in the venom of someone unaccustomed to being defied so publicly. The effect was immediate. A ripple of gasps spread across the room. Some attendees flinched, others froze in disbelief. A man who was supposed to represent control had just lost it in front of cameras, allies, and enemies alike. But Karoline didn't move. She didn't shrink back, didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned in ever so slightly, her voice calm, steady, and cutting, the kind of calm that feels sharper than a scream. "You can shout as much as you want," she said, her words slicing through the silence that followed his outburst. "But the truth doesn't leave this room just because you tell me to, and neither do I." Her response hit like a thunderclap. The room erupted in whispers, gasps, and muffled chuckles of disbelief. Phones discreetly recording from the sidelines caught every word, every flicker of Soros's expression as he realized what had just happened. His attempt to silence her had only amplified her voice. For a moment, Soros sat frozen, his fury written across his face. He had shouted her down, but she had stood her ground. She wasn't leaving, not physically, not rhetorically, not politically. And in that instant, the power shifted. The king of the room had lost his crown, and the outsider had seized the moment. This wasn't just a heated exchange anymore. This was the moment, the viral spark that would explode across social media, dominate headlines, and haunt Soros long after the roundtable ended.
The echo of Soros's words, "Get out," was still vibrating through the air when Karoline's calm defiance cut across the silence. It was the kind of moment that doesn't just happen inside a room. It travels. It multiplies. It takes on a life of its own. And in that instant, everyone present knew they were watching more than just a heated debate. They were watching history being written in real time. Phones angled upward, cameras zoomed in, and pens scratched frantically across notepads. The atmosphere had shifted permanently. Soros, the man known for his cool precision, had broken. And Karoline, the young conservative who was supposed to be a token voice in a stacked room, had refused to yield. The energy in the room was electric. Some attendees smirked quietly, savoring the reversal. Others shifted uncomfortably, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Even Soros's own allies looked rattled, their rehearsed nods and polite affirmations evaporating into uneasy silence. For decades, Soros's presence alone had been enough to silence opposition, but not today. Karoline sat unwavering, her posture straight, her gaze locked. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need theatrics. Her refusal to move, her refusal to back down was the statement. And the longer she sat there, the clearer it became. Soros had lost control of his own stage. Within minutes, the confrontation leapt beyond the four walls of the roundtable. Clips of Soros's shout and Karoline's icy response exploded onto social media. Twitter feeds lit up, TikTok edits looped her words over triumphant music, and Instagram reels replayed the exchange with captions like, "She didn't flinch," and "The moment Soros lost the room." Her line, "The truth doesn't leave this room just because you tell me to, and neither do I," began trending within the hour. Commentators called it a masterclass in composure under fire. Hashtags multiplied, news outlets scrambled for headlines, and conservative voices hailed her as fearless. Even critics, scrambling to reframe the moment as disrespect, couldn't deny the optics. Soros looked rattled, Karoline looked unshakable. It wasn't just a political exchange. It was political theater at its rawest, and Karoline owned the stage. Soros tried to recalibrate, to shift back into his prepared talking points. He spoke about policy, about rationality, about the future of democracy. But the words fell flat. The audience wasn't thinking about long-term reforms or economic models. They were replaying that moment. The breaking of composure, the command barked like an order, and the fearless refusal to obey it. Karoline sensed it. She read the room the way a seasoned fighter reads an opponent. When Soros tried to recover, she pressed forward with precision. "You say this isn't about personalities," she said, her tone cutting but steady. "And yet you made it personal the moment you tried to silence me. You don't defend democracy by shouting people out of the room. You don't defend freedom by controlling who gets to speak. That's not leadership. That's fear." The murmur that followed was louder this time, gasps, quiet applause, even a few cheers. The cameras zoomed in. The young woman who was supposed to be sidelined had flipped the script entirely. Soros sat back, visibly rattled, his composure cracked, his influence diminished. By the time the meeting stumbled to its next agenda item, the real agenda had already been hijacked. The story wasn't about policy, it was about power, and the moment Soros lost it. Karoline walked out of that room not as the token opposition, but as the symbol of defiance, the one who stood tall when the most powerful voice in the room shouted her down. Outside, her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages poured in, from allies, strangers, even rivals who couldn't deny what they had just witnessed. She hadn't just survived the confrontation, she had claimed it. And Soros, for the first time in years, wasn't the one controlling the story. And that's how it happened. The billionaire who thought he controlled the room, shouting "Get out" in frustration, only to have his words turned against him by a young challenger who refused to be silenced. If you found this story as explosive as the people in that room did, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with your friends, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the next showdown. Because this isn't just politics, this is power, this is truth, and this is what happens when someone dares to fight back.